In a quiet, seemingly ordinary town, he was known as the Mad White Man, a disheveled, ghostly figure who roamed the streets with a vacant stare. People called him crazy, unstable and unpredictable, mostly out of fear. Little did they know, he was no madman. Behind his mask of madness lay a chilling, calculated predator with a disturbing plan. Every day he wandered the marketplace, lurking, watching. Children pointed, mothers scolded, and men muttered as he passed by, but few dared to approach him. Only one person ever had the courage, or rather the kindness, to interact with him. Her name was Amara. She was a warm-hearted black woman, known for her compassion. She noticed the man often slumped by the trash bins, mumbling to himself, eyes flickering from side to side. She felt a pang of empathy, seeing him struggle alone, rejected by society. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amara approached him cautiously. Holding a warm meal wrapped in cloth, she extended it with a soft, inviting smile. "Here," she said gently, her voice steady. "I brought you something to eat. You look like you could use a good meal." The man looked up, his blue eyes cold yet startled. He snatched the food from her with a shaky hand, mumbling an incoherent string of words. But Amara only smiled, her kindness unwavering. Every day she returned with a meal, hoping her small gestures might soften the hardened shell he wore. Days turned into weeks, and Amara's visits became the highlight of his day. He began waiting for her in his usual spot, the smallest flicker of anticipation lighting up his otherwise blank stare. His routine carried on as usual, but an unexpected warmth had crept into his icy existence. Yet, beneath this growing bond, the man hid dark secrets that Amara couldn't imagine. By night, he was no longer the Mad White Man. He was a meticulous butcher, a harvester of human organs, with his unfortunate victims always black men and women who wouldn't be missed. Each organ he harvested came with a hefty price tag, funded by an unseen network of powerful white men. These were no ordinary people. They were officials, business magnates, men with deep pockets and shallow souls. One night, Amara's routine took an unexpected turn. She arrived at their usual spot, but the Mad White Man was nowhere to be seen. Confused, she scanned the empty streets, her eyes searching for his familiar figure. She considered leaving, but something inside her told her to stay. After several minutes, she heard footsteps approaching from the dark alley nearby. Out stepped the man, his face pale and his hands trembling. Amara's heart skipped a beat as she noticed what looked like dried blood on his clothes, faint but unmistakable. For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes, a fear that pierced through his usual blankness. Are you all right?" she asked cautiously, her eyes darting from his face to the bloodstains on his shirt. Her heart pounded, yet she remained rooted to the spot, her concern overriding her fear. He hesitated, his mouth twitching as if struggling to form words. But then he looked away, giving her a brief nod before reaching out to take the meal she offered. As he did, their hands touched briefly and she felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation. A spark, almost. Something had changed in him, and Amara could feel it. What she didn't know was that his tightly held secret was slipping, fragment by fragment, with every interaction they shared. Would she be able to piece it together? And if she did, would it already be too late? Amara felt a strange tug of curiosity and compassion that she couldn't explain. Despite the faint traces of blood she'd seen on his clothes, she brushed it off as the remnants of his supposed madness. Perhaps he'd gotten into a scuffle, she reasoned. Yet, something inside her warned that there was more to him than met the eye. As the days passed, Amara became more observant. She noticed things others overlooked. His nails, always meticulously clean despite his scruffy appearance. His worn, patched clothes, which somehow never smelled, the strange glint in his eyes, calculating but quickly masked by a vacant look. Her instincts told her he was hiding something, yet she continued bringing him meals, her kindness unwavering even as her unease grew. One evening, she decided to probe a bit further. As they sat in their usual spot, she offered him a warm plate of jollof rice and watched him silently. After a few bites, she mustered the courage to ask, "Why don't you ever talk to anyone? Don't you have family? Friends?" He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, his face twisted as if searching for the right words. Finally, in a hoarse, almost broken whisper, he muttered, "I don't need anyone." Amara didn't press further, but his answer lingered in her mind. She continued to wonder, who was he? Why was he here? And why did her heart ache whenever she thought of him, this strange, lone figure with a haunted past? But as her connection with him deepened, the town was shaken by a chilling pattern of disappearances. The whispers started quietly at first, stories of young black men and women vanishing without a trace. Their families were frantic, but no one seemed to have answers. Many chalked it up to people moving away, seeking better lives elsewhere, but Amara knew better. The people who disappeared were from poor backgrounds, the kind who had nowhere else to go. No family, no friends who could take them in if they left. The similarities were too many to ignore. One night, as she walked through a dimly lit alleyway on her way home, she overheard two men whispering in hushed tones. "I heard they found another body," one man murmured, his voice tinged with fear. "Kidneys, liver, everything, gone," the other replied, his voice low, like someone's taking them for, you know. Their voices faded as they rounded a corner, leaving Amara rooted to the spot, cold fear washing over her. She'd heard rumors before, tales of organ harvesting, whispered stories passed from one fearful mouth to another, but those had always felt distant, something that happened elsewhere, never here, never this close. A shiver ran down her spine as she thought of the mad white man. Could he be involved in these sinister happenings? The thought clawed at her mind, but her heart resisted. This was the man she'd shared meals with, the man she'd looked at with sympathy, even affection. No, she couldn't bring herself to believe it. Yet the pieces continued falling together, and she couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion any longer. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Amara decided to follow him one night. She waited until he took his usual route toward the marketplace, but instead of approaching, she lingered in the shadows, staying a safe distance behind. He moved with a strange sense of purpose, his steps firm and deliberate. Amara's heart pounded as she kept pace, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. The man led her to the edge of town, to an abandoned building shrouded in darkness. She hid behind a crumbling wall, peeking around the corner as he entered the building. Inside, a faint light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the cracked walls. She felt a surge of dread, but knew she couldn't turn back. She had to see this through. Slowly, she crept toward the doorway, her breaths shallow as she pressed herself against the wall. Through a crack, she caught a glimpse of him. He was bending over a table, his hands moving with a surgeon's precision as he sorted through various instruments laid out in perfect rows. Amara's heart dropped as she realized what those instruments were: scalpels, clamps, forceps, medical tools, tools meant for cutting, slicing, extracting. Her hands flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp as she pieced together the truth. This man, the one she'd shown kindness to, the one she thought was merely broken and lost, was a cold-blooded killer. Just as her mind reeled with shock, he looked up, as if sensing her presence. Amara's heart stopped. She ducked down, barely avoiding his gaze, her body trembling with fear. She couldn't believe it. She'd been inches from this man's dark secret. She'd almost trusted him. She'd almost let him in. But her shock quickly turned to resolve. She knew what she had to do. She had to warn the people, expose the danger lurking in their midst. Yet, as she turned to leave, her foot scraped against a loose stone, sending it clattering across the floor. Her heart raced, and she pressed herself against the wall, praying he hadn't heard. There was a pause, a heavy silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. And then she heard his footsteps approaching, slow and steady. Her stomach twisted as she realized there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Amara closed her eyes, preparing herself for the inevitable. But the footsteps stopped, and she heard him let out a low, ragged sigh. It was a sound filled with weariness, with a strange vulnerability that caught her off guard. "You shouldn't have followed me," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His tone wasn't menacing, but there was an undeniable weight to his words. Amara slowly opened her eyes, finding him standing a few feet away, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of sorrow and something else, regret. She couldn't understand it, but for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a glimpse of the person he might have been, the person buried beneath layers of guilt and darkness. Why do you do this?" she asked.